All right. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to this session this evening. My name is Hendrik Pieterse. I will serve as moderator tonight, or perhaps, I don't know, Dr. Young, keep the fights to a minimum. Is that perhaps? Fights to a minimum. Okay. We'll try and do that. But it is a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to go over the, you've heard these before, but I was instructed to run through the guidelines very quickly for our process tonight. And then I'll have a very brief introduction of Dr. Yong, and then we'll hear his presentation, which I will follow myself very much. As the format goes with these, there will be two parts to the evening's session. There's going to be a presentation by Dr. Yong, followed by a question and answer period. It's going to be my job to serve as moderator. And let me just point out one or two things before we start in terms of the question and answer session. I would really encourage you, as I'm sure you've done in other sessions as well, to jot down your question that you would wish to ask Dr. Yong at the end while the presentation is going on. Have it at the ready for our question and answer session later on. Or I should say, given what I think we're going to get, you will have several questions. And I suggest you pick the one you would most like a response to from Dr. Yong. So be ready to bring the question. Use the microphone that's at the center there, because the session is being recorded as are all the sessions here, and we want to make sure that we have good sound quality and that everyone else can hear as well. We ask that you please, in the interest of time and for the sake of helping, making sure that as many as possible can participate, limit your participation at the mic to a question. A single question, please. No commentary, no comment. We can do those things later on. You're welcome to it. But for this evening, if you could ask a question, that way as many of us as possible can hopefully participate. All right. Let's get right to it. Dr. Amos Yong is the professor of theology and mission, as well as director of the Center for Missiological Research at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Before that, he was at Regent's University School of Divinity, where he taught for 9 years. Dr. Yong brings graduate degrees from a variety of schools and disciplines, theology, history, and religious studies. Did so at Western Evangelical Seminary, which is now George Fox University, Portland State University, and Boston University, where he finished his PhD degree under Robert Neville. Now, by all accounts, as you know, Dr. Amos Yong is one of the most prominent theologians at work today, with a special influence on Pentecostal theology. Indeed, his scholarship has truly been foundational in Pentecostal theology, interacting with both traditional theological traditions and contemporary contextual theologies, and really covering a rather dizzying swathe of topics and themes, including theologies of Christian-Buddhist dialogue, disability, hospitality, and mission of God. He's a prolific author, as many of you know. Has authored or edited more than 30 volumes, and has also written numerous articles in Theological and other journals. Among his growing corpus of books, I'm not going to mention many of them. You can find them yourselves there, but I will mention simply The Future of Evangelical Theology, published in 2014, as well as Renewing Christian Theology, published in the same year, Pneumatology and the Christian-Buddhist Dialogue, and also The Spirit of Love, a Trinitarian Theology of Grace. I do want to say that I'd like to add to this just one splendid little volume called Hospitality to the Other, which he published in 2008. It's a slim volume that packs a big theological punch, and like many of my colleagues, I have used that book with great benefit in my own classes in global Christianity at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. So thank you for that very timely work that continues to be of great help to me as well. So this evening, Dr. Yong will address the conference theme with a presentation entitled Fire from Heaven on the Charismatization of World Christianity, Treks, Trends, Trajectories. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yong.
Good evening. Thanks particularly to Bill for the invitation to be here this weekend. Appreciate it. And to Karen and Francis for all the work that they're doing to make sure the conference is going smoothly. Bill mentioned to start out a couple yesterday, time flies when you have fun, that he thought that perhaps this conference might be an opportunity for some arguments. Perhaps there might be 3 arguments that we might want to pick on for my talk. Number 1, is there such a thing as world Christianity? Number 2, what about the charismatization of world Christianity? Is it happening? What does that mean? The third fight, well, if there is something like the charismatization of world Christianity, is it good or not so good? I'll let you pick the fights after I'm finished. One can hardly speak coherently about global renewal Christianity, much less its charismatization of world Christianity in scope of one paper. I'll focus on select treks, which are historical analyses, trends, which are contemporary realities, and trajectories, which are potential, if not probable, future developments of this global renewal movement in order to highlight some of the intersecting issues relevant to the field of so-called world Christianity. The main question explored in what follows is how what is happening in the former, meaning global renewal Pentecostal Christianity, may illuminate discussions in the latter, meaning world Christianity. So let's look at some treks. What is renewal Christianity? The term renewalist came into prominence in the 2006 report by the Pew Research Center entitled Spirit and Power, a 10-country survey of Pentecostals, wherein it was used, quote, as an umbrella term throughout the report to refer to Pentecostals and charismatics as a group, unquote. I will adopt this all-inclusive designation in this essay, although it will become clear, especially in the next section, that what comes under the charismatic label is much more complicated than considered by most conventions. So in the next few pages, my focus will be on the Pentecostal movement, and particularly debates within the field of Pentecostal history and historiography, not only in order to understand better the complexities of global renewal movements, but also to get perspective on similar discussions that have unfolded in the field of world Christianity. It's the work of Walter Hohenweger, now widely recognized as the doyen of Pentecostal studies, that a gradual shift began to take place in foregrounding William Seymour's Azusa Street mission over Charles Parham's Topeka School for Pentecostal Origins. Whereas in his first English language publication on Pentecostalism in the early 1970s, which was a distillation of his 10-volume German language doctoral dissertation, whereas his first English language publication moves expectantly from Parham to Seymour, from the beginning, Hohenweger had been attentive to both the complexity of the worldwide Pentecostal movement and the peculiar characteristics of Pentecostal spirituality, especially as shaped by the multicultural constituencies of the Azusa Street mission. More specifically, Hohenweger noted Seymour's African-American holiness background, and this suggested that even in the North American context, the former Pentecostalism unleashed in the Los Angeles mission was shaped as much by black slave spirituality as by either Parham's or Seymour's holiness religiosity. Most historical accounts of the modern Pentecostal story begin with either the outbreak of glossolalia at Charles Fox Parham's Bethel Bible College in Topeka, Kansas on the first day of the new year in 1901, or at William Seymour's Azusa Street Mission in Los Angeles in the spring of 1906. To be more precise, however, it has only been during the last quarter of the 20th century that the latter has become prominent in the historiography of modern Pentecostal origins. Part of the explanation for this shift may be due to the fact that the initial scholarly accounts that emerged around mid-20th century were written by the first generation of trained historians belong primarily and mostly to white Pentecostal denominations such as the Assemblies of God, for whom the defining feature of Pentecostal spirituality was encapsulated in the classical, you know what classical Pentecostalism is now because Mel Robeck gave us a good explanation of it before. The defining feature of Pentecostal spirituality was encapsulated in the classical Pentecostal movement's distinctive doctrinal contribution, which was tongue speaking as an initial evidence or sign of the reception of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. By this time, meaning by the mid-20th century, white Pentecostal churches had already begun the process of assimilation into the broader North American evangelical subculture. This was evinced by the inclusion of the Assemblies of God in the founding of the National Association of Evangelicals in 1942. Thus, it was to be expected that the theology of tongues and spirit baptism was accentuated as what distinguished Pentecostalism from its evangelical cousins. Toward this end, Charles Parham's Bible College was viewed as the natural launch of the modern Pentecostal revival, specifically because the teaching of evidential tongues was formulated within and promulgated from that site in Topeka, Kansas. Almost 3 decades later, then, Hollenweger produced his magnum opus in which he identified 5 root influences nurturing the modern Pentecostal movement. The black oral root related to the Africanisms that persisted in African American religion and that was transmuted through Seymour's leadership at the Azusa Street Mission that featured koinonia between people from different cultural, racial, and linguistic backgrounds. Second, a Catholic and distinct but yet related evangelical root related to John Wesley and the American Holiness Movement streams carried by Parham, Seymour, and many other Pentecostal ministers of the first generation. Third, a critical root that characterized Pentecostalism's non-conventional spirituality, at least when measured by modern and Enlightenment modes of rationality. And then an ecumenical root related to the fact that converts to the Pentecostal movement in the early years came not only from holiness, but many other Protestant traditions, both in North America and in Europe, if not also from elsewhere. For our purposes, the black oral root is primary in this account, leading Hollenweger to ask whether Parham or Seymour ought to be recognized as being at the head of the movement. Aside from the well-documented racism of Parham, Hollenweger cast his lot with Seymour, less for historical than for theological reasons, I would suggest. Quote, although there's hardly a Pentecostal movement in the world that is not built on Seymour's oral black modes of communication, the important question is this: where does one see the decisive contribution of Pentecost? In the religious experience of speaking in tongues as seen by Parham, or in the reconciling Pentecostal experience of Pentecost as seen by Seymour, which of course includes glossolalia and gives it an important role, unquote. So that was Hollenweger. Hollenweger's point is not that the initial evidence doctrine that sets, the initial evidence doctrine doesn't set Pentecostalism apart. It is this one claim that separates classical Pentecostalism from other more ecclesial confessions in the broad evangelical movement. Rather, Hollenweger's point is that the Pentecostal form of worship and spirituality that is embodied and affective, rather than primarily cerebral, that is what distinguishes Pentecostalism or Pentecostal spirituality from other Christian traditions, and it also accounts for its resonance with and expansion across the majority world. The point is less that there are multiple originating sites to what is now known as the global Pentecostal movement, and more that Pentecostalism's explosive growth in Asia and Africa and Latin America are arguably due to its oral culturality, manifest palpably in Seymour's Azusa Street Mission, and then dispersed by the Azusa Street missionaries around the world. Again, the issue is not to dismiss either local agency or even the appearance of Pentecostal-type revivals around the world before 1906, but to emphasize that the Pentecostal mission from Azusa Street was as effective as it was precisely because of its oral modality, informed by what Hollenweger calls this black root. And this was consistent with, if not altogether similar to, the oral spiritualities that nurtured revivals in these other parts of the world. So it's in this context that we can appreciate the contributions of one of Hollenweger's most influential students, Alan Anderson, who has been already referred to here. Anderson complicates, if not undermines, North American origins thesis by calling attention to how Azusa Street missionaries were received in other parts of the world, precisely because the ground had been prepared beforehand by indigenous Pentecostal-type revivals. Anderson's point, consistent with and extending Hollenweger's argument, is that the Pentecostal spirituality of Azusa Street was convergent with the oral spirituality of revivals happening worldwide preceding and following 1906. What ought not to be underestimated about Seymour's mission was its catalytic role in establishing a worldwide network of missionaries, connecting these otherwise disparate centers of revival. In that sense, the missionary fervor and impulses precipitated by the Azusa Street mission can be acknowledged. Whatever else might be said about its oral spirituality, its essential missionary nature and commitments are as, if not more important, for understanding the expansive scope and global reach of the early classical Pentecostal movement. The preceding observations about Pentecostal origins and historiography may helpfully illuminate the contested question in world Christianity scholarship about the relationship between the West and the rest. If in earlier generations the emphasis was on church history that told the story of Christianity from the perspective of the ecclesiastical and institutional centers in the Latin and Western world, contemporary scholarship prefers a Christian history approach that highlights local agency, especially in the non-Western world. I would like to suggest that the gradual shift in Pentecostal historiography from Parham to Seymour and Hollenweger spirituality hypothesis provide instructive parallels, at least on two related fronts. First, whatever the historical facts are, which may generate consensus or contestation, as usual, there are good reasons to adopt one or a number of other theological rationales to understand the history of Christianity from the beginnings of the day of Pentecost, being carried by many peoples, cultures, languages, and nations. Second, in building on the first, the point is not to minimize the contributions of the Western tradition, but to provide a more complete account of non-Western reception, agency, and roles in the forging of the history of Christianity. Along this line, then, it does not matter whether the priority of Western missionaries can be documented, since in the end, local reception depends in part on local agents and factors, and these will often have at least historical roots antedating the missionary arrival. The historical work of historians like Dale Irvin and Scott Sundquist and the historiographic contributions of Lamin Sane are helpful in this context. Irvin and Sundquist are engaged in a multi-volume project that seeks to retell the history of Christianity as including but being irreducible to Western developments. If Hollenweger and Anderson aid us in seeing that there are not only multiple roots to the modern Pentecostal movement, but that the roles of indigenous receptors of the message are crucial in understanding its global spread and appeal, then Irvin and Sundquist assist our comprehension of the multiple strands and diverse trajectories of the early and ongoing worldwide Christian movement. And also help us to understand how local agents have played important roles in the reception, planting, and nurturing of the Christian message both in the West and then among the rest. Lamin Sane's work, meanwhile, complements these others not only because of his emphasis on Christian mission as essentially about translation of the gospel and the Christian scriptures into vernacular languages and local idiom, but also that this task of translation is theologically rooted in the early Christian movement as well as instantiated in its holy texts. Thus, Sane also suggests that we can understand the history of Christianity, not only the history of Christian mission, as unfolding amidst, in, and through indigenous, if not oral, cultural dynamics, and this regardless of the extent of the role of Western missionary efforts and initiatives. The point so far can be summarized thus, that developments in Pentecostal studies, and especially in Pentecostal historiography, reflect and maybe parallel the shift of focus, however contested, from the North American West to the majority world, even as the emergence of world Christianity as a field of inquiry is itself demanded by the increasing awareness of the roles of non-Western agents and perspectives, again, however understood in the worldwide history of the Christian movement. Now I want to turn to contemporary trends. And I will argue that have persisted for the last half-century, these trends. Here we move forward from the first generation of the modern classical Pentecostal movement to dynamic and fluid developments initiated with the charismatic renewal movement that has emerged in the mainline Protestant denominations and the Roman Catholic and Orthodox communions since the 1960s. These charismatic renewal movements have been called variously neo-Pentecostal movements, charismatic streams, Jesus people movements, etc., etc., etc. Many have distinguished between these charismatic movements that have their origins in the 1960s from later Pentecostal and charismatic type movements like the Vineyard, apostolic, and other more or less independent ministries and churches from the late 1970s and into the 1980s, and have collected some of these under the category of neo-charismatic or third wave. While there are distinctions that might be helpfully made between these second, meaning the earlier charismatic renewal in Protestant and Catholic traditions, and then this third wave, between these second and third streams of the global renewal movement, I will combine them for the purposes of our discussion going forward. My point is that current trends in global renewal Christianity include, but cannot be reduced to even these various streams or waves, however you might call them: classical, Pentecostal, charismatic renewal, neo-charismatic, third wave, some say fourth wave, etc. And such ferment is in part why understanding global renewalism is imperative for the field of world Christianity writ large. To press this point and carry it forward, I note that charismatic renewal movements, while perhaps less energetic in some mainline Protestant denominations in North America today, where most of these originated a half-century ago, yet they are quite central to the growth of Christian churches in the majority world. By this, I'm observing at least two phenomena. First, that the growth and expansion of Protestantism in the global south, on the African continent, Asia and Latin America, but particularly in Africa, remains fueled by these charismatic renewal movements within the historic churches. And second, that the ongoing vivacity of contemporary Roman Catholicism worldwide has been sustained, at least in part, by these charismatic renewal developments within its ranks. The former, meaning within the worldwide Protestant communions, has been documented amply by researchers, such that most observers of Christianity, again especially in the African context, realize that Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, Lutheranism, for instance, are growing in that continent primarily as Pentecostalized or charismatized movements. When we examine the East Asian context, this is further borne out. Large Protestant denominations in South Korea are essentially Pentecostal in spirituality, if not in name, even as the explosive growth of Christianity in rural China is sustained by the Pentecostal and charismatic practices, even if not its nomenclature. The point about contemporary Roman Catholicism as a global phenomenon is perhaps as remarkable. Some Roman Catholic scholars are arguing that charismatic renewal is not only pervasive, if not predominant, where that form of faith is most vigorous, but perhaps is even salvaged in some respects Catholic Christianity for the 21st century, specifically in and through developments in Latin American hemispheres. We've touched on some of those things already these last couple of days. Interestingly then, when charismatic renewal first emerged in mainline Protestantism in the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s, the task was to understand these in relationship to the modern classical Pentecostal movement. 5 decades later, the quest is to clarify how Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality might itself be essential to the ongoing life and evangelistic mission of the church. This is true especially in the majority world context where these historic churches are growing and even expanding precisely as Pentecostal and charismatic type movements. Again, maybe not often using that label, but certainly in its features. Such Pentecostalizing and charismatizing trends are prevalent not only in these historic churches, but also across the broad scope of evangelical Christianity around the world. If in Anglo-America, post-denominational impulses are threatening the survival of mainline Protestantism, these same dynamics are transforming evangelical free church traditions so that congregational independence and networks of groups of churches, congregations, are now at the vanguard of missional Christianity, so-called missional Christianity. It is precisely in this environment that third wavers, fourth wavers, apostolics, and other movements, again, Pentecostal charismatic type, have emerged, and a wide range of independent Pentecostal and charismatic groups and organizations have flourished. The result is the dual Pentecostalization of evangelicalism and the evangelicalization of Pentecostalism, at least on the Anglo-American scene. This means both that classical Pentecostal churches are progressively indistinguishable from evangelical churches, at least on the surface of what happens in their, especially Sunday morning services, and that evangelical spirituality, piety, and worship are increasingly also exhibiting Pentecostal and charismatic features. Non-denominational churches and congregations are developing into megachurches with their own networks of relationships, and more often than not, these are intentionally Pentecostal or charismatic in orientation, if not at least implicitly imbibing of such spirituality in practices. So out of this milieu, the so-called third and fourth wave has crashed ashore and washed ashore a myriad of independent congregations, networks, and movements nationally and internationally, drawn together by a common spirituality, a common set of Pentecostal-type values, and a common set of charismatic-type missional commitments. In the global context, things are increasingly difficult to name. There are certainly Pentecostal, charismatic, there are certainly Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical, and even denominational and historic churches and traditions, but there are as many independent-type movements that may or may not go by any of these names as a primary means of self-identification. But yet they still, all of these have loose or other kinds of connections and relationships with one or more of these groups and movements and churches, to the point that adherents may often embrace such a description in some sense in their own overall Christian identity. It is in part for such reasons that observers of the coming and in many ways already here world Christianity recognize the centrality of Pentecostal charismatic features, but yet are reluctant to name such according to these labels. Thus, Philip Jenkins, to take one example, realizes that even as the center of gravity of Christianity is shifted to the global south, majority world Christians are Bible believers, albeit maybe not fully in the North American fundamentalist or evangelical mold, but in the Pentecostal charismatic oral mode, that which is described by Hollenberger, I might add. Generally speaking, then, what appears as the most vigorous form of Christianity in the worldwide frontline may well be characterized as evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic type, which is in that sense what I here am calling renewalists as an overarching category. One point I want to make before turning more explicitly to consider interfaces with the field of world Christianity, and this picks up from my comment above about the growth of renewal Christianity, especially in inland and rural China. All the more recently, with the reopening of China to the outside world, Western influences are leaving their mark. For almost a generation during the Maoist and Cultural Revolution eras, Christianity existed on Chinese soil due almost exclusively to indigenous efforts. Thus, the form of renewal Christianity in China is quite autochthonous, nurtured by distinctively Chinese adaptations of the faith mediated from early periods rather than shaped by Western or missionary legacies. Yet these developments are certainly not unique to the Chinese front, but are to be found around the world, perhaps most intensely in the African context over the last few centuries. The indigenous, the independent churches, and so on. What is interesting to note, especially in the sub-Saharan African context, is that the late 19th and early 20th century indigenous Christianities were forged on a similar anvil as that which facilitated the arrival and growth of Pentecostal and charismatic renewal movements on African shores. African independent or instituted churches were thus not only those founded by Africans for Africans, but also almost always pneumatic in their overall orientation. It was and is in this latter arena, or in this latter sense, that these indigenous churches have been similar to those emergent from out of the Pentecostal charismatic Christian milieu in the African context. Although most Pentecostal and charismatic believers would reject or be suspicious about African indigenous Christian forms and practices, primarily because of the presence of African traditional and religious and cultural features carried over into the Christian sphere, and even if those who inhabit the latter social and religious space do not usually identify with either of these labels, yet members and adherents are united across both spectrums by the prominent, if not preeminent, role of Pentecostal-type spirituality in their worship and in their piety. Hence, renewalism often includes not only Pentecostal and charismatic types, but also indigenous and independent churches and movements whose spirituality is pneumatic and in that sense difficult to ignore when considering the vitality of renewal across Asia and across Africa. I think one of the difficulties of all the numbering is how do you include, who do you include in these numbers and on what basis and on what reasons? Whether you're talking 300 million, 500 million, 800 million, it's how do we define these? I want to turn explicitly now to asking about the relevance of contemporary renewal Christianity for the study of world Christianity. It should be obvious by now that many of the issues that have been unearthed in the preceding paragraphs have been and remain central to the latter field of inquiry. Because renewal movements, understood according to the broad scope covered in this in this paper has been at the forefront of world Christian growth and expansion. Studies in world Christianity have not only been embroiled in trying to understand and name this renewal phenomenon, but have been effectively shaped by these movements, like it or not. Thus, there is increasing consideration of the charismatization and even pentecostalization of Christianity in this global Christian context. It is thus becoming increasingly difficult to speak about renewal Christianity and world Christianity separately. Nevertheless, 3 cautions are appropriate in this connection. First, it is appropriate for students of renewal Christianity to press questions specific to those movements, regardless of how diffusive they may be in reality. So remember, when I use the word renewal, I'm including classical Pentecostal, charismatic renewal in their multiple waves, and a lot of these indigenous Pentecostal charismatic type movements around, in particular in the majority world. I'm saying that it's appropriate for us to keep pressing questions specifically in these domains, even though they're quite diffusive across these definitions. We're still only at the very beginning stages of comprehending renewalism in its various facets and complexities, so sustained exploration and focused consideration of their differences is still needed. Second, despite the palpability of renewalism across the world Christian landscape, such nevertheless provides only one set of lenses for scholarly analysis. To focus on world Christianity only through renewalist refractions will seem reductionistic, not only given the limitations of any single analytical lens, but also because of the breadth and richness of the Christian tradition and its global permutations. Finally then, if renewalists have from the beginning of the modern Pentecostal movement understood their contribution not as a displacement of the existing Christian tradition, but as its renewal or its revitalization, then in that sense we can understand renewal studies as complementary to the study of world Christianity. In that sense also, distinctive trajectories of research and inquiry will benefit both sides. In particular, students of renewalism can learn much from the research and scholarship on world Christianity, how that's defined, especially since the latter's interdisciplinary interfaces will continue to generate new and innovative perspectives and questions on both fields. Even as students of world Christianity can be helped by attentiveness to the questions and concerns registered by scholars trying to understand this most vibrant of segments across the world Christian landscape. In this final section, I want to put on my more explicitly theological hat and ask some theological questions that bubble up at this intersection where renewal movements and the study of such meets with the study of world Christianity. The trajectories I propose to explore then are theological. Specifically, I want to ask what renewalism contributes to world Christianity and to world Christian theology, besides its spirituality, its missionary zeal, and its reinvigoration. The question is more precisely put this way. What are the implications of renewal movements, spirituality, phenomena, mission, and vitality for Christian theology more generally? So as a theologian, I've been driven over the last few decades primarily by this and related questions. If Pentecostal charismatic piety is supposed to renew the Church Catholic, small c, big C, take or pick, then might Pentecostal charismatic spirituality also renew the Christian or Catholic theological tradition? So let me essay some hypotheses at 3 levels, historically, missionally, and biblically. What are the theological implications of the renewal historiography unfolded in the preceding, the first part of my presentation? How does or should renewal history inform renewal theology? Or how does or should renewal history or historiography inform Christian theology? What theological lessons might be derived, for instance, from the morality of renewal spirituality and its amenableness to flourishing in the indigenous ground of world Christianity? So 2 considerations present themselves, one looking backward a bit and another looking forward. From the perspective of a historical theologian, I would suggest that the oral spirituality of renewal Christianity invites a reconsideration of Christian historiography itself. One that shifts the gaze of the historian and the gaze of the historical theologian in 2 interrelated directions. Toward non-literary sources, to the degree that such can be mined for historical insight, and toward the affective dimensions embedded in or discernible within historical data. To rely solely on written texts or documentary evidence is to privilege the perspective of the literate and the elite, while to read texts or other historical data only for their cognitive content is to miss the communicated affect through which oral cultures relate. The point is that the multiculturality of contemporary renewalism that is constituted by and constitutive of many sites of linguistic, symbolic, and semiotic importance, quite apart from any dominant imperial or ecclesiastical center, all this combines to press the question of how the histories of renewal can be told in the history of the Christian tradition itself, emanating as they have from multiple spaces, localities, sites, and times. The renewal of Christian history requires a renewal historiography, one attentive to multiplicity, not only in terms of historical sites, but also in terms of modalities of communicative media. Looking ahead, similarly, our shift into the multimedia and multisensory era of the telecommunicated age is promising for the development, articulation, and preservation of renewalism's manifold expressivism. Toward this end, the renewal of Christian theology in the 21st century might be facilitated, at least in part, through the many tongues of renewal spirituality. Ideally, the multiplicity of global renewalism foregrounds the need for a dialogical theological method, one attentive to the many levels of theological engagement, the many levels, the spirituality in its many expressions, its discursivity in the ecumenical renewal movements, and the Catholicity of world Christianity. All this invites us to be methodologically plural in engaging with the full range of all of theological and related disciplines. Renewal theologians face steep challenges at this juncture, however, not only in having to contend with and against the anti-intellectualism prevalent across wide swaths of the global renewal movement, but also in then needing to translate renewal values, commitments, and insights into the discourses of other churches, guilds, and disciplines. Yet such crossing of ecclesial, academic, and disciplinary boundaries ought to be expected for renewals. And this leads to our missiological considerations. Renewalists have been motivated perennially by the promise of Pentecost in the book of Acts 1:8, "But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." From this starting point, they have been emboldened, encouraged, and motivated to go, to explore, and to reach beyond the confines of the comfortable. This missionary dynamic of modern renewalists has already been noted above, so it is not surprising to mention that renewalists have emerged first in the Theological Academy in the field of missiology. As expected, their contributions have unfolded from out of their spirituality and its implications for mission, the foregrounding of indigeneity, the role of the charismata, especially miracles, healings, and signs and wonders, and perhaps most importantly, the centrality of the person and work of the mission Spirit of God. I suggest that renewal missiology can fruitfully interact with at least the following two trajectories of missiological inquiry: those connecting studies in world Christianity with Christian mission history, and those connecting missiology with mission theology. So I'll make some comments about these two trajectories. The first potential renewalist missiological contribution springs off many of the openings afforded by the discussions that we've already touched on. This involves not only the history of renewalist mission among classical Pentecostal and charismatic movements in the 20th century, but also analyses of mission strategies and their effectiveness as instructive for the present and future missiological work. Such studies will triangulate methodologically by drawing from analytical perspectives in renewal studies, in missiology or history of missions, and studies in world Christianity. Each of these disciplinary angles can draw from the other two, even as the findings can extend discussion in these various directions. If the lines are blurred between where the discipline of Christian history leaves off and the field of world Christianity begins, then lessons can be learned also from where the history of Pentecostalism blends into the emerging area of Pentecostal mission history. Parallels between how each of these conversations is being adjudicated can be mutually informative. If historians of Pentecostalism and of Pentecostal mission history can learn from developments in the wider world Christian historical field, then those laboring in Christian history and world Christianity can also gain from the very dynamic arena of global renewalism as a contemporary instance that can shed light on how the past is to be investigated and understood in relationship to present tasks. As a theologian, I'm also interested in how Pentecostal mission history opens up to Pentecostal and, by extension, Christian mission theology. If theology is a second-order discourse grounded in and emergent from out of what is happening on the ecclesial ground, then Pentecostal mission history provides the data, context, and material for Pentecostal mission theology in particular, and for Pentecostal theology in general, even as both trajectories of the latter, Pentecostal mission theology and Pentecostal theology, also have the potential to feed into broader developments in Christian mission theology and theological discourse in general. The challenges and opportunities confronting Pentecostal expansion, mission, and understanding theology combine to indicate less and more promising directions for thinking in the present fluid and dynamic world Christian context. For instance, the transmutation of the primarily Latin and Occidentally dominated Christian tradition into the majority world signals upheavals for the theological task in the 21st century that Pentecostal mission history and theology may well be able to facilitate. Not necessarily resolve, but at least facilitate discussion like we're doing this weekend. This has to do not only with the putative correlation between Pentecostal spirituality and indigenous cosmologies, but also with the fact of Pentecostalism being equally at home in a modern and postmodern Western world, or maybe pre-modern Western world. Tip of the hat. Hence, Pentecostal ematology can be queried for insight into theological issues in global context, both in the West and in relationship to the rest. Herein may lie the promise of a Pentecostal pneumatological missiology and holistic theology for the third millennium, one that resists the bifurcation and dualisms of West/rest and natural/spiritual, among others. In the end, though, the promise of Pentecostal historiography and missiology and mission theology are dependent, at least for Pentecostal Protestants, if not also increasingly also for Catholic, Orthodox, Charismatics, and others, on biblical moorings. Biblically, renewalists would want to say that they seek no more than a restoration of apostolic Christianity. As restorationists in that respect, renewalists are focused on the apostolic teachings and the way of life of these earliest followers of Jesus as Messiah. It is not necessarily a desire to emulate literally the apostolic examples, although in some circles that may well be what such restorationism is presumed to be. Instead, the point is to live as people of the Spirit, as the apostles were Spirit-filled and empowered to accomplish their tasks, following in the footsteps of the Spirit-anointed Messiah. Such a restorationist hermeneutic guides renewal readings, retrievals, and reappropriations of the apostolic writings. In part for these reasons, Pentecostals envision that their own lives unfold from out of the apostolic path, opening up, as it were, to the rest of the church and its histories, being various versions of the 29th chapter of the book of Acts. To be sure, there is no agreement about the normative character of such 29 chapters across the global renewal movement. Many renewalists focus on the allegedly supernatural manifestations of the Spirit's apostolic work and insist on their ongoing vitality for the contemporary church and world, although others would counter that such supernaturalistic rhetoric is more a legacy of the enlightened paradigm that depends on the contrast with its own reductionistic naturalism. Despite a lack of consensus about what apostolicity means in the present time, I understand that here in DePaul that means a whole bunch of other things that I'm not thinking about, but we can argue about that too. So, start over. Despite a lack of consensus about what apostolicity means in the present time, renewalists across the spectrum agree that the Acts of the Apostles are neither more or less than the acts of the Holy Spirit. In that sense, what is aspired toward and hoped for is a more rather than less pneumatically charged Christian existence and witness, regardless of how, wherein, and whence such unfolds. If the Day of Pentecost narrative provides the ongoing template for how to understand the presence and activity of the Spirit of Jesus Christ and of the living God in the world, then the plurality of such witnesses and testimonies in the many tongues, languages, and cultural traditions of world Christianity will remain with us going forward. If nothing else, observations about the global renewal vis-a-vis world Christianity will continue to press a question that has been around since the time of the apostles. Quote, what does this mean? Unquote. A millennium later, Joachim Abbot of Fiore picked up this query and wondered if the fulfillment of the promise of the Spirit was nigh, and almost a millennium after that, modern renewalists have been assuming that theirs is the culmination of the age of the Spirit, the latter rain outpouring of the Spirit, classical Pentecostals would insist. The Pentecostal and charismatic theologians have now considered that the contemporary global renewal movement is the harbinger of a fully Trinitarian theology, undergirded by a robust theology of the third article, which is what I would call a pneumatological theology, that will be consistent with the pluralism and diversity of the many tongues of world Christianity in the 21st century. The outside observers of the same renewal permit are also considering this as being at the vanguard of the age of the Spirit for the third Christian millennium. From such a theological standpoint, it is never inappropriate to invoke, "Come, Holy Spirit." Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Paul Coleman from Notre Dame. Two quick questions. One is, what do you think about the role the extent to which Orthodox Christianity is also undergoing charismatization? There are a couple 100 million of them, and they have a different history. Huge growth in the last 40 years, and potentially some more. So that's the first question. The second would be the extent to which the charismatization of world Christianity can be interpreted as a response to people's experiences of powerlessness that are particular in the last 110 or 120 years, and whether you see any connection between these different waves of Pentecostalization and experiences of powerlessness that occur in late capitalism, or whatever, how we want to periodize the contemporary period.
Thank you. I think lots of possibilities for conversation between Orthodox and Pentecostals. A lot of it has been on the proselytism side. There are probably others that can address it a little bit better than I can. I would say that one of the things that a second and later generations of some of the classical Pentecostals, and maybe even some of the charismatic renewalists are proceeding, there's still always this, maybe it's this lack of rootedness, and therefore a sense of wanting to connect more with the tradition. Some become Catholic, but many are attracted to Orthodoxy for a lot of different reasons. I think what's happening in Orthodox rich contexts like East Africa, I think provide us with all kinds of very intriguing possibilities to think missionally and particularly theologically as a theologian. So, from my perspective, I would say if you take the many tongues metaphor seriously theologically, then every one of the Christian traditions can be said to have any number of charisms that can contribute theologically for the ongoing theological reflection of Christians in the 21st century. So, from a renewal point of view, I think more and more of folks are studying. Mel Robeck did his dissertation on Cyprian and those folks. More and more renewalists, I think, are studying the first millennium, and then in that respect also connecting with historic Catholic but also Orthodox traditions. Powerlessness. I would say that that's one of the tough questions. I mean, in terms of historical causality, which is not necessarily what you're asking, but there's certainly, we can say, a lot of different possible historical circumstances that might precipitate searching, looking, but I think that it's always going to be a complicated thing of trying to trace any kind of direct, either 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 correlation between these kinds of things. In the global context, what is interesting that we talked about a little bit earlier today, prosperity forms of renewalism. And in those contexts, there might be some that are attracted to prosperity messages because of a sense of powerlessness, but there's a lot of other reasons why people join up to those movements, quite aside from feeling powerless. So, again, it's a complicated sort of a thing. Again, I would say that it's certainly understandable that this can be one precipitator of conversion to renewalism, but I would not probably want to make the whole thing out of it. Thanks.
Amos, that wonderful presentation. You began your presentation with a question. Is there world, Christianity, and by extension, is there such a thing as a world, pentecostalism? This question, it brought to my mind also the ideas of Professor Hans Ackerman in his book, Fusion and Confusion in World Christianity, whereby he says that Christianity in a global context, if not well understood, well discerned, and well fused by the power of the Holy Spirit, it may lead to confusion and righteous, multiplication and the radicalization of Christianity. And he says, finally, it does injustice to the church as a mystical body of Christ. And that's why my question is, from your, presentation, what would be your comment on the role of world Pentecostalism or world Christianity to the church as a mystical body of Christ in that context? That's what it's about. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I don't think I've read Ackerman yet, so I'm not going to be addressing that particular issue. There's a sense in which I think that all of our nouns, whether it's world Christianity, Pentecostalism, charismaticism, or take any noun, Catholicism for that matter. I don't know, you Catholics think that Catholicism is one thing. And I would say something like this, our nouns are useful fictions. They're placeholders for us to have conversation. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are no common features to various forms of Catholicism that might give it some kind of coherence so that these useful fictions actually serve useful purposes. And so in that respect, I would say, well, there is probably something like world Christianity, there's probably something like world Pentecostalism, but this probably something like doesn't seem very, very enthusiastic, right? Which is just the caution that after we recognize that these are useful fictions, that we don't forget the fact that world Christianity is constituted by a lot of different kinds of things, as is world Catholicism, I would imagine, and world Pentecostalism. So then the question, of course, is, well, what justifies these useful fictions? What allows us to use these as placeholders to talk intelligently with one another? And some of us might privilege a more doctrinal kind of definition. So Christianity, what justifies talking about Christianity as a noun is something like common adherence to the Nicene Confession, let's just say, right? Well, there are lots of Baptists that don't like creeds. Their faith is Nicene in piety, but not Nicene in confession. So what's the point I'm trying to make, right? I think your question was, well, can there be a spirituality that can provide some justification for talking about this unity? Give some coherence to whatever we want to talk about, Christianity, Catholicism, renewalism. I think in that regard, I would probably say something like, well, I think that talking about mysticism or spirituality or the common experience of the work of the Spirit gives us another angle into this question of how do we talk about these wholes. In other words, for those for whom a doctrinal definition is elusive, well, maybe the spiritual pneumatic side can provide at least a common starting point for conversation, ecumenically and in other ways. And certainly within Pentecostal traditions, people like Mel Robeck have long made the argument that there's Pentecostal spirituality that provides a starting point for ecumenical conversation, and maybe not that it's going to join us all and make us all sing Kumbaya at one point, at a later point, but the point is, you got to start somewhere. And maybe you start with the creeds, maybe you start with the Bible of your, or maybe you start with Charismatic.
Thank you, Dr. Yong. Most inspiring. Just two quick questions. First of all, you talked of the Pentecostalism of evangelicalism, Pentecostalization of evangelicalism, and the evangelicalization of Pentecostalism in the American context. Could you just say a word of explanation for those of us who are not Americans? The second point, subsuming everything under the label renewal. Renewal is a very loaded term. It's got that positive charge. As you're aware, the government in Kenya is was attempting to bring in legislation to stop the harm done by many of these new developments. I think they've withdrawn their legislation, but in Uganda I think it's still on the books. And the University of Pieterse in South Africa in the next few weeks is running a seminar on shepherds or charlatans, again dealing with this more dysfunctional aspect. And I just wonder, I don't really know what, I don't want to overemphasize this element, I don't even know what to call it. Let's call it the less inspiring aspect of these developments. And I just wonder whether your word renewal has left this element out of it entirely.
I was hoping you wouldn't bring it up, but you know. Okay, so yes, the category of evangelicalism is no less complicated than Catholicism, Christianity, Pentecostalism, renewal, right? Then there's so many different levels there as well. You know, it's evangelicalism in the North American context, some would say, would be connected to the establishment of the North American Association of Evangelicals, which was in the 1940s, which provides at least a kind of organizational umbrella for these movements. But even there, you know, it's still contested in many ways. In the broader historic traditions, you could say something like evangelicalism reflects streams of pietism coming out from the Reformation, whether it's of the Lutheran sort or of the Methodist sort, etc., etc., etc. So, for some people, world Christianity and world evangelicalism are synonymous in various of these respects. You know, the kinds of pietistic streams that you know, call attention to this kind of very vibrant personal faith. And so you've got, therefore, I think one of the interesting questions is whether or not you subsume Pentecostalism under evangelicalism or vice versa. I mean, if the National Association of Evangelicalism is taken as identifying what contemporary evangelicalism is, then Pentecostalism actually preceded evangelicalism, historically, in that respect. But if evangelicalism is understood as representing this kind of piety, this kind of Reformation-type Protestant piety that unfolds itself variously in Europe in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, all these reactions to a kind of more, let's say, cerebral or less pious kind of forms of Protestantism, then in that respect, you know, some scholars would say that Pentecostalism is the grandchild of the Wesleyan movement. All right. Well, the point is, I think that kind of discussion or debate about the relationship between the two is in part, I think, what makes trying to adjudicate these issues both complicated as well as helpful when trying to talk about world Christianity. Because there is a sense in which you could say something like, even for Roman Catholic charismatics who are engaged in the charismatic renewal, well, they're practicing a form of various forms of historic pietistic kinds of spirituality. So in that respect, you've got multiple ways to come at these issues. So I don't want to say too much more about that. On the issue of the shepherds and the charlatans, you're right that renewalism is complicated, and there's a sense in which every movement and every label accumulates some baggage over time, right? So there's a sense in which classical Pentecostal, I think over the last 2 or 3 decades, have been wrestling with how do we keep ourselves relevant, because they've been threatened by charismatic renewal streams outside of their own networks and institutional and other related structures. The explosion of the demise of denominationalism and mainline Protestantism has also impacted classical Pentecostal denominations. So the point would be something like, well, people aren't coming to Pentecostal churches like they used to, which means there's some baggage to it. And so, well, we need to name ourselves something else. So, you know, you go to an Assembly of God church now in North America, and unless you dig deep, you don't find the word Assemblies of God sometimes in the name. You got to go peeking around or something like that. The name itself has the baggage, right? I think the point about renewalism has to do in part with the baggage that's accumulated, with Pentecostalism, and even with charismatism. I think there have been some comments in the last couple of days about the rise and maybe waning of charismatic vitality in various segments of the movement around the world. And so, in other words, a lot of churches that are Pentecostal charismatic type don't want to call themselves Pentecostal or charismatic precisely because of the charlatans. But they're not going to let go of this spirituality, this vibrancy of the spirituality. So how do we use that label? And so in some circles, therefore, this notion of renewal has come in as, well, it's new enough so you can define it according for your own purposes. So for my purposes, renewal leaves out the charlatans because we don't want to carry them around. I'm just kidding. But your point is well taken. That people want to have the 500, 600, 800 million because you can maybe generate something, funding, with those numbers. But with 800 million comes a lot of charlatans.
So thinking of your third question right here, which is it good? You've given a pretty implicit answer to that question in this sort of, is the charismatization, that's such a hard word to say. Is it happening and is it good? You've given at least a very winsome account of what that might look like and what that would mean. There's probably an implicit answer there. What I'd like you to do is answer it the other way.
I've got job security if I say yes.
Yeah. What I'd like you to do is answer it another way. So I think it's easy to answer that question positively and to say, well, certainly in this polylocality that you've described, how can that be anything other than good? And yet, for the majority of Pentecostals, I'm not sure they'd answer it the same way. I was thinking this with Nelson as well, right? So Ruth Marshall writes about Nigerian Pentecostals who say, we're just Christians. And when they say that, she says they're not being ecumenical, right? They're being polemical. They're making a really clear claim about inclusivity and exclusivity that denies the very kind of polylocality that you've brought out here. So I'm just wondering if we think through that. You can take your pick how you do that, ethnographically, theologically, whatever, historically. How might we answer that question another way? Or maybe the mini version of that is what's lost in this sort of increasingly diffuse kind of polyvocal treatment that you've given.
I'm not sure I can address the question of what's lost. I think that really what we're realizing today, what we're sensing today and living today, is much more of an awareness of the plurality that's always been there, but up until more recently, it was more difficult to really have a palpable sense of that. Okay, so plurality's always been around, but until we have means of communicating outside of our little neighborhoods, we don't realize that there's a whole lot of difference out there from what we are. And in that respect, I would say something like the third millennium and our particular space and time right now forces plurality upon us in ways that demands us to take account of it. So to answer your well, maybe not to answer, but to think a little bit more into your first question, I guess I would say something like this, that I don't know what other Pentecostal theologians are going to do or want to do with this plurality. What I want to do with it has always been not just do Pentecostal theology, but how does this Pentecostal plurality speak back to the Christian theological tradition? So I'm trained as what's called a systematic theologian, which might be something like that means I'm a dinosaur of some sort. From the genre, from the task of systematic theology, that's always had its own canons, its own encapsulated sorts of discourses that are all kinds of parameters. That's what I've been motivated as a theologian to speak into. So in that respect, I'm less interested in developing a theology for the Nigerians, Pentecostals, or the Chinese Pentecostals. Well, it's not that I'm not interested in it, but I'm less interested in that. What I'm more interested in is what does the theological tradition do with the fact that Nigerian Pentecostals and Chinese Pentecostals and Catholic Charismatics in the Philippines, etc., 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 all behave this way, act this way, live out their Christian life this way, charlatans and all. What does that do for us theologically? So that's the question I'm interested in as a Pentecostal theologian. Now, that may not be a question that most Pentecostal theologians are interested in, but that's the one I'm interested in.
So 2 questions. One is, you mentioned in your talk that the renewal movement can provide data for theology. Theology as a second act reflection on the data. Could you just say what that might look like? What kind of theological conclusions could you make out of the data? And then the second question is, at what point does a renewal movement not be new anymore, right? How long does it have to go before it needs to be renewed, right? I mean, at what point does a renewal movement, if it becomes the status quo, then are you looking, I mean, part of what motivates this question, I think, is a sort of existential kind of middle-age kind of thing, where I'm sort of glad that I don't go to charismatic kind of church, because I just don't know how much enthusiasm I can muster anymore as I get into middle age. It sounds exhausting, and I'd rather just have a nice quiet sort of. And I wonder. I mean, so part of the question is about the kind of movement as a whole, and I guess a sub-question within that is there a lot of turnover where you kind of need converts because the enthusiasm kind of leaks out of it after a while?
Oh, relax, Bill. There's lots of churches I can send you to that come under the renewal category. You can sit there and hold service and be just So the Reformed tradition has a phrase that goes something like reformed and always reforming. Semper reformanda, right? And my inclination is to say something like, well, I think renewalism lives into that Reformation instinct or sensibility, in the sense that it does err, if you will, on the side of the charisma as opposed to the institution. But to the degree that all institutions need renewal, then your question really becomes something like, yeah, as long as we're historically rooted, or as here before Jesus comes back, then there's always going to be space for renewal. Hopefully, a lot of that won't have to mean I'm going to have to jump up and down the rest of my life. I'm with you on that one, you know. But yeah, renewal can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, or sounds and looks and feelings. So I would. This is an old question, right? Institution and charisma, and of course, how do we navigate that? So when we become institutionally formed and shaped, there's a certain sense in which there's a lot more for us to lose because of our centrality, our lack of marginality at that point. And in that respect, there is a sense in which renewal does come from the margins. It comes from, and again, I mean, you'll have to talk to more sociologists of institutions to talk about how do institutions get renewed. You know, so that would be the way in which I would want to think about the new and renewal. When does it ever get not new? Well, it never would be, because every institution needs renewal of some sort. It's at various of its stages. And you might even want to say something like institutional vitality, to the degree that there is any of that, will involve an ongoing process of renewal. So in that respect, I would say that would be, I think in that respect, it would be something like, you know, the Pentecostals initially never wanted to, like Luther, never wanted to go start their own church. It was always about, well, this is supposed to be Christian life as it is. What does that mean? How do we continue to live that out, like, in a vital way? And I think I forgot your first question.
Oh, you said about the renewal movement provides data for theology.
Oh, data, right. Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of consistency, for example, with some of the recent turns to the anthropology of Christianity, in the sense that so the earlier generations of anthropologists of Christianity would go off and study, you know, this little isolated group in the middle of Africa and so on and so forth. But there's a sense in which now the anthropology of Christianity is looking at Christianity all over the world, including in the West and so on and so forth. Why? Because now we're observing what people are doing all over the world instead of just a small group out there in Africa or something along those lines. And there's a sense in which renewal type movements do things in all kinds of different ways. And again, it's not that you can't study liturgies, fixed liturgies of high church traditions anthropologically. You certainly could, and there are people that do that. But there's a lot more exciting things to look at and study and observe when you talk about renewal movements, right? And so in that respect, I would say it gives us a lot of data. In that respect, I think it invites us and gives us a fresh lens, for instance, to look at the history of Christianity, which has been dominated by what texts have preserved. Well, I think we're developing better and better skills at using texts as icons, getting back into the life of these communities. So historically, for instance, charismatic movements oftentimes were marginalized because they were heretical, or they were not quite orthodox, or they were dangerous, and maybe they were many or all of those things. But 20th century Pentecostalism was also initially marginalized for exactly those reasons, right? So the very fact that now we can understand the dynamics of modern renewalism, at least more sympathetically, that gives us methodologically, historiographically, or data-wise points of re-entry into the Christian tradition, into those points and spaces where charismatic renewal movements have been marginalized for this, that, and maybe other good reasons, but now we've got better tools to excavate the data. Maybe textual data, but all kinds of other data through text as icons. So in all of those ways, I would say that our own increasingly sensitized and sympathetic understandings of contemporary renewalism gives us new approaches and new data to reassess things.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if you can help me think through some matters about which I'm undecided myself from some work I've done with sort of Catholic and some mainline Protestant experiences about enculturation. We've heard a lot during the day today about what sorts of things perhaps have been advantageous in the spread of Pentecostalism, whether those are affinities or correlations with indigenous cultures, experiences, and so on, other kinds of things. I'm wondering about, as we assess the mixed harvest of any kind of a movement in the church, how much of the growth perhaps presupposed some sort of enculturation on things that perhaps shouldn't have been adopted. I think about the experience early on in the American context of the extent to which early Pentecostalism was relentlessly interracial, as well as having a strong pacifist stream. And to the extent that the growth capacity of the movement took off, it had to shed those things, lest it become, irredeemably marginalized in the context of the United States and elsewhere. It had to make its peace with the Jim Crow segregation inside its own congregation. It had to make its peace with the rush to the First World War, and so on. And as we think about enculturation as, again, one of those terms that conceals as much as it reveals, how much maybe you can help me think through, adopting and embracing those parts of culture that perhaps may have been better left behind.
Next question, please. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, I'm not just kidding. But, right. Because enculturation is certainly not just a majority role issue. And I do think that one of the big challenges from my guild of theologians, systematicians, and other qualified versions of that is that we are grappling now with the fact that, well, all theology is enculturated in some way. For good or ill, well, that's the question. And it's difficult. It's a difficult shift to make because, we uphold the theological tradition like the Nicene Confession, so on and so forth, as normative standards, right, that are valid cross-culturally. So there is less ability to recognize first its own culturation, that of the dogmatic tradition, for instance. But then, even if we were able to recognize that all of our confessions are contextual in some respect, we always have to then fend off the relativism fear, because, well, now all of a sudden, well, if it's just contextual, then it's not necessarily for everybody. In which case, well, yeah, why not let the Nigerian pastors develop their own confession, And so I think the theological tradition is struggling with that at this point. How do we talk about Christian universality in a way that's defensible and intelligible for the 21st century, given our own increasingly unavoidable and undeniable historicity across traditions. So, all right, so how do we, well, and I don't know about this, but I mean, you mentioned interracialism and pacifism, and I want to say something like amen, amen. Well, what does that mean? We've got to talk about context now. We've got to talk about what's the context in which we're now going to put forth, let's say, an interracial church, just to use your language. Or what's the context within which we're putting forth a vision of pacifism, which is not even a biblical term necessarily, but let's just use that as a placeholder, like we're talking about, right? So if we're going to put forth a claim about pacifism as theologically normative, what does that mean? And who's the we that are putting that forth, and for what purposes? So I would therefore say we're back in some respects to relying upon our anthropological friends who have to document for us, well, here's what these folks in this part of the world mean when they say that, and here's what they were trying to do with it. And then we can say, okay, do we now, whoever the we is, buy that? And if we do, then we can co-opt that into our agenda. Well, that's how the conversation would unfold at that point. And I guess from my perspective, to come back to that point, I think we now have more access to the many tongues than we did before. That complicates life, because now you just got to sort through all that much other more, all the background noise as well as what's really there for us in order to really do theological work. But I guess, on the other hand, keeps us busy, do some job security, I guess, I don't know. You can tell I'm a very insecure theologian, so.
So I'm going to address the elephant in the living room here, at least from my perspective. I started off as an evangelist, Catholic evangelist, hello. And I really haven't heard anybody talk about today, all day today, talk about the charisma, the foundational message of Christianity. We as Catholics call it the first proclamation. Would you not agree that, and maybe comment on this, that the rise and the fall of charismatization of world Christianity is really a secondary issue, and the real primary issue is, are we preaching the gospel? Are we engaging people in its claims? And is not the power of salvation and the release of the Holy Spirit directly tied to that? And that's really our issue.
Amen. I agree. Yeah, so, that does, I think what you're saying presses the question of what the theological task entails. And so I'll just now agree and then qualify and say something like, I think that there are multiple trajectories for the theological task. Arguably, the most important and the chief of it is for the mission work of the church. But there are also other kinds of jobs that theologians have to do. Some of it is apologetic. And apologetic means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But from my perspective, what apologetic also means is the question of intelligibility. That's also a mission task at a certain level. But the question of intelligibility at the grassroots is different from the question of intelligibility in academia, which is in part where we're located. So as part of that question is how do we understand, how do we render intelligible the kinds of very fantastic and charlatanous types of realities that this movement entails, within the different contexts within which folks in this particular room do their work, right? So yes, on the one hand, what we do is it's supposed to render intelligible as a matter of charismatic proclamation. Because oftentimes I think that in renewal movements, in fact, I saw something somewhere. Oh, there was something on Facebook this afternoon that I saw. It says 5 things that we should stop Pentecostal pastors from doing. And one of them was to stop preaching biblically illiterate sermons. Okay. Right? And then we went, yeah, so anyway, we can go all, we can go so many different directions there. But part of my point would be, well, intelligibility for us as theologians, not that I'm a Pentecostal theologian, again, as I try to clarify, right? But to the degree that we attempt to render intelligible our discourse, hopefully that will trickle down at some point. How do we communicate that to our pastors so they're preaching less biblically illiterate sermons? So, right?
Thank you, Amos, for this presentation. I sense from the many questions that have been raised concerning key terms that you use that require a lot of qualifications. I'm just wondering if a lot of these key terms might be in danger of what we call dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. And that raises the question, is the topic itself on the charismatization of world Christianity an appropriate topic to start with? You get what I mean?
I think so. Well, I guess my answer is that it wasn't an appropriate topic to start with. That's why I didn't go first. A little bit more seriously. Right. Well, unless if somebody wants, I'm going to ask another question. There are many different ways, I think, to come at. Well, maybe another way to ask your question, Simon, is maybe a different version of your comment, which is, what's most important about these issues and why? Right? What's most important about these issues and why? So if we foreground the missional question, then that foregrounds a particular set of questions for this. And I think, as I've tried to say, my felt sense of vocation has been more speaking back to the theological tradition. And that this title, in some respects, reflects one angle of that, right? I mean, I'm trying to get at world Christianity and whatever we call intercultural theology or global theology. I'm trying to get at that angle by foregrounding charismatization. So have I got an agenda with this particular? Oh, absolutely, I've got an agenda with this question, and I've got lots of books to sell you to back this question up, right? But that may not be the most important question for maybe in the big picture, in the big scheme of things, in the whole scheme of things. Or, like I said, that may not be the question that 99% of other Pentecostal theologians feel is the most important one. And I'm certainly not going to claim that this is the only or most important question for everybody. But it's been one for me.
Let's take perhaps one more. Question, follow-up question? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Young. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.